and the argument that I make in this project, and I stand by it, is that the black athlete is the most important, most influential, and most visible black employee this country's ever produced. They're the ones who made it. They're the ones who integrated before the military integrated. Black athletes integrated before schools were integrated in most parts of the country. They integrated before pretty much everything. They're the ones who received entry into white universities.
I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, presenting the acclaimed new book, The Heritage. Howard Bryant is a senior writer for ESPN and regularly appears on their programs. He's also a sports correspondent for NPR's Weekend Edition. He's been a finalist for the Society for American Baseball Research Seymour Medal and for the National Magazine Award, and has received the Salute to Excellence Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. He's the author of 2 books which have won the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year, The Last Hero, A Life of Henry Aaron, and Shut Out, A Story of Race and Baseball in Boston. He's written and edited a number of other books, including books for young readers, like the new Sisters and Champions, The True Story of Venus and Serena Williams. Bill Littlefield of WBUR's Only a Game calls The Heritage powerful and thought-provoking, and the Pacific Sanders says that Bryant writes with a kind of vim and turns darkly comic and serious that pulls you from page to page. It's a bracing analysis that brings clarity during a hazy season of kneeling and blacklisting of patriotism and heroes. Please join me in welcoming Howard Bryant.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's always good to be back in the Boston area. I don't get to come here that often, even though I only live like 90 minutes away. But it's always fun, and especially because there are so many familiar faces here, people that I haven't seen in years, and family, of course, which is always best. I don't know if I can live up to that. Vim, I don't think anyone's ever used that word for anything I've ever written, but we'll take it, right? We'll take it. It's a good thing to at least be recognized for work that you think is important, things that you feel very strongly about. And this is a project that I feel extremely strongly about and have for a long time. And I'm glad that we were able to do it. And thank you to Sanj and Pam over at Beacon Press for making this possible as well. It's not something that everybody wants to write about or talk about. It's much easier to write about things that are fun, which is why I wrote a children's book. It's like that was the palate cleanse for doing this project. I actually wanted to talk a little bit about how this project came to be and how I felt that how it was time to sort of do this project and the different ways that it could have gone. I have what I refer to the book writing process as my 5 steps of anxiety, and anyone who writes knows that there are probably 50 or 60 more steps of anxiety when you're trying to finish something. I think for me, with my column at ESPN, the magazine, I had been working on these ideas pretty much ever since maybe, I think it was Trayvon Martin that really did it when he was killed in Florida by George Zimmerman, and of course the brazen nature in which George Zimmerman has carried himself afterward, that it really did bring the question, did Black Lives Matter at all? And to me, if you're of a certain generation, you are used to athletes being involved politically. You're used to the Jackie Robinsons and the Paul Robesons and the Yalis and Bill Russell and Jim Browns and so many athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. You're used to that heritage. You're used to that history where they actually used their platform to be politically active, to speak for their people, and to not back away. If you're of a different generation, you're not used to that. If you were born in the 80s, or even the 90s, you don't remember that. You're used to something very different. You're used to athletes not getting involved. You're used to athletes selling sneakers and soda and Gatorade and being super rich and not being part of the society, because over the last 40 years or so, athletes have transitioned from being one of us to being one of them. They are super rich now. I think even as late as the 1970s, I think the average professional athlete was earning 6.5 times what the average American made. Today it's over 200 times. So they're not us anymore. And so that said, there's a certain responsibility that remains with the player, especially with the black athlete, but then there's also a distance that they have because of their wealth. And so for me, after Trayvon, and then in 2014 with Ferguson, and then Eric Garner, and all of the things that began happening, and also the viral nature of social media, you began to have athletes take a stand and take an interest in social elements that they really hadn't been involved in before. And I had a good conversation with Carmelo Anthony, who then played for the Knicks, who was talking about how in the past everybody wanted to be like Michael Jordan. You wanted to be like Mike, and Michael Jordan did not get involved in political issues. And now it was almost a repudiation of the Jordan way to actually start speaking. And so that was news to me. That was something that obviously, when you do reporting, if it's not supposed to be there, it's a story. And it was interesting to see that these players were finally starting to get involved in ways that we hadn't seen them get involved in the past. And it's really difficult for athletes as well, because on the one hand, when the players don't speak, we say, well, you know, how come these guys are so bland, and why are they so boring, and how come they never say anything? And then when they start speaking, we say, shut up and dribble and stick to sports. So they really can't win. And it was interesting here to see them not just get involved, but to actually risk something. And that's been one of the big questions for me when we talk about this nature of a heritage, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'll say it anyway. You start asking yourself the questions of, are you really in the pantheon? Do you belong in the pantheon of a Paul Robeson, who lost everything for speaking out? Do you belong in the Jackie Robinson pantheon, who, as much as we anoint him to sainthood now, Jackie Robinson was not offered a job after he retired from baseball, even though everybody wears his number now. He was essentially blackballed from being in the front office or to have a job in Major League Baseball. Until the day he died, he never worked in baseball again. Or Curt Flood, or Tommy Smith, and John Carlos, or all of those players. Do you really belong in that pantheon simply by wearing a t-shirt? Do you belong in that pantheon by having Nike sponsor a commercial? You're earning from that. Is there really a risk involved here? So that's one of the questions that I wanted to ask and find out, and not really get too far ahead of myself, considering that as much as we sell everything in this culture, you can also sell protest. Protest is profitable now. So that was one of the questions. The other question for me as well was, what was the environment in which this revival was taking place? And the revival was taking place in a time of super patriotism post 9/11. That I don't think that anyone can I don't think anyone can emphasize enough how important 9/11 has been over the past 18 or 17 years, or 18 years next year, in the packaging and in the selling and the marketing and how we sell sports to the public. And I just don't think that what was really interesting in doing this book was when I had spoken with Beacon Press, with my editor, Rakia Clark, about doing the project. She was interested in doing a book about the history of the black athlete and the revival of protest. And I thought that that was a good idea, and I'd been thinking about it myself. But I had also felt that you couldn't do this book without talking about the influence and the impact of 9/11. And the fact that when we go to games, every game now has first responders to start the game. And especially in this town after 2013, after the Boston Marathon bombing, that you have the flag the size of the Green Monster. You've got it the size of a tennis court now. You've got it on the 50-yard line on the basketball court. Everywhere you go, there is some form of military presence. And some people would call that an authoritarian presence, or a militarization of sports, and nationalism, jingoism, all of these different things. And these things are all byproducts of 9/11, but they're also a byproduct of commerce. Because when we soon find out that it was the Department of Defense who was actually paying for these displays, that these displays were not organic, that these displays were something that was a part of a business deal between the New England Patriots and the Massachusetts National Guard. And so what does that do to the display itself? What does it do to the organic nature of saying thank you? Are you supporting the troops, or are you selling camouflage jerseys because they're alternate jerseys and people want to make money? And how do the troops feel about that? How do veterans feel about that? What is actually taking place with these two collisions? And especially when you add a Colin Kaepernick to this conversation, where his protest against what was happening in the street between police and the black community has been co-opted and misdirected into being disrespectful toward military. What is taking place? There's this collision, and then of course you add Donald Trump to it. And then, whereas you have all of this taking place, and now you add that sort of demagogic presence where he's going to essentially deny your citizenship for disagreeing. And is that who we are? So there was a lot to talk about. There's a lot happening. And so to me, the question had been, getting back to my 5 steps of anxiety, number 1 is, do you have a project? And obviously, yes, there's a lot happening. There's plenty to talk about. And number 2 is, can you get it? How do you tell this story? How do you go after it? And so one of the things that we had sort of compromised on, well, it wasn't really a compromise. I got my way. I won, which was, we're going to have both. We're going to talk about 9/11 in this book. We're going to talk about the impact of 9/11, but we're also going to talk about this heritage of black athletes and where that heritage went. What happened after Bill Russell and Curt Flood and 68? What happened until 2012? Where did that heritage go? And one of the things that I've always talked about in the project, and I say this quite often anyway, is that there are 3 stages to the black athlete, or not black athlete, to sports in the 20th century, now moving into the 21st century. The first stage is the immigration story. When we all think about the history of sports, you think about the immigration element of it, all the young kids coming in from the old world, how to become American. The fastest way to become American for those kids was through sports. And you had your ethnic heroes, whether your heroes were boxers, or whether it was Honus Wagner for the Germans and Babe Ruth for the Germans, or Joe DiMaggio with the Italians, and all of those different, learning how to read a box score and speak English and all of that stuff. A lot of that went through sports. And the second wave, obviously, is the integration story, where African Americans, and the argument that I make in this project, and I stand by it, is that the black athlete is the most important, most influential, and most visible black employee this country's ever produced. They're the ones who made it. They're the ones who integrated before the military integrated. Black athletes integrated before schools were integrated in most parts of the country. They integrated before pretty much everything. They're the ones who received entry into white universities, even though there was a very rich and long history of black intellectualism. But it was the ball players who got to go to UCLA and got to go to Kansas and got to go to USF and all of those schools. So while we tell the player to shut up and play, the player is the one who's paving the way, even ahead of the doctors and the lawyers and everybody else. And so what is that? So to me, that was black body over black brain. And so I felt like you had this collision that was taking place and happening right now, whether we're talking about militarism and we're talking about nationalism, but we're also talking about silencing a voice. And what do we do with that silencing of the voice? Why are we silencing this voice, the athlete voice, especially in a time when money is dominating the whole world? I mean, the only reason we're talking about Michael Bloomberg as a mayoral, or as a former mayor, is because he was rich. We have a president who's president because he was rich. Why are we talking about Mark Cuban or Oprah Winfrey being presidential candidates? Because they're rich. Celebrity and money are taking over everything. But when we talk about the black athlete, we want them to be quiet. Why do they have to be quiet? And I think that has a lot to do with this relationship that we have between the black player and our fandom. Sorry to ruin your fun. And so there are a couple of different pages that I wanted to read from, sort of encapsulating where we were, or where we are, and sort of how I felt about this stage that we're in, and about this heritage. And to me, I refer to Paul Robeson, obviously, before even Jackie Robinson, as the charter member and first casualty of the heritage. And Robeson, people don't really know this because they remember him as the great baritone, they remember him as the great singer and actor, but he played in the National Football League. He was a defensive end. He played in 1921 and 1922. And then people wonder what happened to the great Paul Robeson, and it was because he didn't play football anymore. He had other plans, but also because the NFL imposed segregation on black players. So the NFL was integrated, and then it wasn't until 1946. So for a quarter century between 1923 and 1946 with Kenny Washington, the National Football League didn't have black players. So we talked about that, and then also the fact that this collision that we're in right now, we talk about Donald Trump, where he positioned dissenting views as unpatriotic at best, traitorous at worst, to both the United States in general and the country's armed forces in particular. Black players such as Colin Kaepernick enjoyed wide support from military members and nationwide black police organizations that were committed to eradicating police brutality, but it didn't matter. Sports, if not completely nonpartisan, but famously ambivalent to overt political messages, was sending its own message through its fans, its media, broadcast partners, teams, and leagues. The American flag did not represent ideals. It was supposed to be obeyed. And that's one of the big changes, because players have always been involved. I think when you look at the heritage for me, I always look at players, especially the black athlete, as getting involved initially through World War II. That was really the big first moment where you're talking about, one, the Jewish athletes wanted the black players to boycott the 36 Olympics out of solidarity with the other Jewish athletes and with Jewish Americans. So they were being asked, and Jesse Owens and company and Mac Robinson and the rest were being asked not to get involved, or to be involved, but to not go to Berlin. Then, of course, you had some of the great columnists in the New York Times and the Washington Post, Westbrook Pegler and some of the others, who were really asking the black athlete to step in and parry the arguments of Nazi Germany that you cannot view yourselves as any better than we are because you have segregated hospitals. Your people don't even sip out of the same water fountains. So how can you say you're better than us? So, of course, they bring out Jesse Owens and Robinson and the black athletes to sort of parry that, okay, no matter what is happening in our country, there's still a meritocracy, and this meritocracy is through sports. That no matter what else is happening in the country, if my score beats your score, I win. And that's a very American thing. Of course, we all know that's not true, but it was sold as being true. And then, of course, the next element of this heritage was 1949, when Paul Robeson had said that African Americans would not fight in the Cold War on the side of the United States, that black Americans would be treated better by Russia. And so what did the United States do? Well, House Un-American Activities Committee went to Jackie Robinson and had Jackie Robinson testify in 1949 against Paul Robeson to reassure the country that African Americans were loyal to this country. So once again, on these three elements, we talk about shut up and play, and we talk about black athletes not getting involved. They weren't even talking about black issues. They were establishing themselves as citizens. And one of the great things about that, to me, in terms of getting involved as a citizen, was the idea that the players themselves didn't even talk about black issues yet. And I kind of thought that was kind of cool, because the way we sell this is we sell this notion that black athletes are talking on behalf of black issues only, but they were actually talking about American issues. But then, of course, there's the great Robinson, and I don't think you can ever talk about Jackie Robinson enough. And Jackie Robinson and Malcolm X fought like hell constantly over this issue back when he had his column in the 1960s. And Malcolm X would constantly criticize Jackie Robinson for ruining Paul Robeson's career. But what we never really reported on was the rest of Jackie's testimony. And he also said, after saying that he thought that Americans, of course, black Americans would be loyal to the United States, he also said, and one other thing the American public ought to understand if we are to make progress in this matter, The fact that it is a communist who denounces injustice in the courts, police brutality, and lynching when it happens does not change the truth of his charges. Just because communists kick up a big fuss over racial discrimination when it suits their purposes, a lot of people try to pretend that the whole issue is a creation of the communist imagination. But they're not fooling anyone with this kind of pretense, and talk about communists stirring up Negroes to protest only makes present misunderstanding worse than ever. Negroes were stirred up long before there was a Communist Party, and they'll stay stirred up long after the party has disappeared, unless Jim Crow has disappeared by then as well. That's the heritage. That's it right there. And from that day forward, if you're a black athlete, no matter how good you are, and if you talk about Michael Jordan, for everything about Michael Jordan, what's the one thing people say about Jordan? Nah, he wasn't there for the community. What's the one thing people say about Tiger Woods, no matter how great Tiger Woods has been? Well, he wasn't black or white, or he was Cablinasian, whatever he chose himself to be. But he ran away from that responsibility. That responsibility is going to stay with you no matter where you go, no matter how many points you win, no many points you score, and championships you win. I had a very funny conversation with Al Sharpton about this when I was doing the research on this book, and I had said to him about Jordan, and he said, well, at some point, everyone's going to ask where you were on this issue. They're going to ask, where were you, just like people were asking us when things were happening in the 1960s. And what are you going to say to them? And I knew he was talking specifically about Jordan. And he said, what are you going to say to them? And you're going to say, look at my trophy? Who cares about your trophies? I was like, that's pretty good, Al. Is that on the record? Can we keep that? So we can keep that. That's in the book. We like that. And so that, to me, was really sort of the root of the heritage. And you have the players, whether you're talking about baseball players, and baseball's really, even though there's only 7% baseball players now, it's very tight-knit. Those players understand that history, and it all goes back to Jackie. I was talking to Dusty Baker about this last year when he was managing the Nationals. And we were talking about tracing that heritage all the way back. And I told him, I said, I can get you, and we play 6 degrees of separation, I can get you back to the start of the Negro Leagues in like 4 handshakes. He's like, no, you can't. I'm like, yes, I can. I was like, you shook hands with Hank Aaron shook hands with Satchel shook hands with Jackie. And he's like, damn. I was like, yeah. It goes that far back. And so that history being as strong as it is, it also sort of made me wonder what took place in the 1960s and the 1970s when it would all disappear. And I talked about these first 2 acts in the 20th century athletic story. Immigration story is the first, integration story is the second, but the third is the commodification story. It's the money. And by 1975, after one of the great victories when baseball players got their free agency, by 1980, players were making $1 million a year. By 1990, they were making $3 million a year. LeBron James makes $36 million a year now. His net worth is $450 million. When LeBron James first played, before he played his first game in 2003, 2004, he had signed a $90 million deal with Nike. He had $90 million in the bank before he made a basket in the NBA. So it sort of shows you the financial power that these players have. And to me, one of the big issues with that financial power is, what are you going to do with it? And Rakia and I, my editor, we battled about this. And she was very adamant about the fact that that money should give you protection. If you've got that much money, they can't touch you, especially if you have that much talent, if you have LeBron James's talent. One of the reasons I love sports, covering sports so much, is because it's one of the few areas where the employee actually has enormous power. I can get fired tomorrow, but there's one Tom Brady. There's one LeBron James. There's one Aaron Rodgers. So those guys have an amazing amount of protection that most employees don't have. And so the question is, what are you going to do with that power? And I think what you saw in my lineage, I keep hitting this. And so, one of the things that in my lineage is O.J., Michael, and Tiger. O.J. had other problems, obviously, in the future, but it started with O.J. Simpson, and then Michael Jordan, and then Tiger Woods. Those 3 athletes, there's a saying in the clubhouse in Major League Baseball, and pretty much every clubhouse, is that the smartest guy in the room is the player with the biggest number of zeros on his paycheck. So if you're the guy, everybody follows you. And people follow, bless you, again, everybody followed O.J., and they followed Michael, they followed Tiger. And the path that they set was to not get involved, was that now you had mega corporations getting involved. You had Nike and Adidas and Pepsi and all of these companies getting involved. And Tiger's a very specific, is a very specific example, and I'm going to talk about him in a second, that here's a guy who actually tried at first to, or was told by his dad, that he was going to be this person who was going to be like Muhammad Ali. He was going to be one of the guys who tied his identity to racial issues. He said for a time, Woods would embrace the destiny his father had forecast for him, paying homage to the history of the sport, to the lonely pioneers such as Lee Elder and Charlie Sifford, black pros who endured the insults and indignities of playing a game in a white world that could not have been more metaphoric of the impediments to the American dream for black people. As with Jordan, the seasoned Nike ad machine was there, choreographing the legend that was being built on the course, the ads being voiced over by the father even after Earl Woods died in 2006, reinforcing his specialness, packaging his destiny. And when it came time for the prophet to spiritually lift the poor and the weak and the despised black people and give them dignity through his talent, as he was destined to, he sat down with Oprah Winfrey, the wealthiest black American in the world, and told her and the world that he was not black. He was a composite. He was Caucasian, black, and Asian. He told Winfrey that growing up, he'd coined a term for his multi-ethnicity. He told Winfrey he was Cablinasian. Woods did not say, I'm not black, I'm OJ, but he gave the equivalent for a multicultural world. The end result was the same, a reinforcement of the O.J. Simpson model, but on an even more public stage. There was no advantage to identifying with being black. That came with responsibility. Take, for example, the time when Woods was hitting supernova status, the most talked about athlete in America. He had just won the Masters, and now, as his father had predicted, he would move mountains. It was an unsubtle comparison to Ali, a wish to join the heritage. It was all coming together. It was also 1997, the 50th anniversary of Jackie Robinson entering the majors. The Jackie Robinson Foundation contacted Woods asking him to participate in the celebration at a Mets game, side by side with Rachel Robinson. Tiger Woods demurred. He said he was busy. He said he had an overwhelming number of commitments to his sponsor, to Nike. Tiger Woods stiffed Rachel Robinson. Frustrated but undeterred, the foundation looked up and down the lineup card, went to the bullpen, skipped the eighth inning setup guy, and went straight to the closer. Not Michael Jordan or Arnold Palmer or Jack Nicklaus, but the most powerful man in the world, President Bill Clinton. The president personally called Tiger Woods and told him the same thing. And Woods told him the same thing. Thanks for the call, Mr. President, but I'm swamped. Tiger, Bill Clinton said. What commitments? I'm the President of the United States. Who do I have to call? I think I can get you out of them. Tiger Woods held firm, giving President Clinton the same stiff arm. The president offered to send an Air Force jet to deliver him to Shea Stadium. Instead, Woods was in Mexico partying on the beach with his friends. Tiger said no, not just to the president, but to the heritage. Now he wasn't even black. He was Cablinasian. Even Nike, his risk-averse corporate sponsor, was horrified. Cablinasian? What the hell was Cablinasian? Nike sold products, but did so through storytelling. And here was Tiger Woods telling America that its favorite bedtime story, the black athlete breaking barriers into entry, and those old white institutions bending to a new day, each meeting each other in the middle to mutually overcome racism and fulfill the promise that America could overcome its deepest scar, after all, wasn't the story anyway. Nike saw the lucrative and eminently sellable narrative of an African American who conquered the exclusive white sport go up in flames. Quote, I thought this was a new form of denial, Al Sharpton told me. And the subtlety that was disturbing to me was its subliminal message, that our children should feel almost ashamed of being black. And we have to find a way not to be that. The message was, he's all of this, but doesn't want to be that. Therefore, I shouldn't want to be that. And that's the pressure that the athlete feels in a lot of ways when the player gets involved in these issues. They know what's coming next. We saw what happened with the Adam Jones thing in Boston a couple of years, well, it was last season, 2 years ago. When, it was last year? They're all rolling together, Adrian. They're all rolling together now. And what happened? Now you're going to go to Jackie Bradley Jr. and Mookie Betts and David Price, and you're going to ask them about this stuff. And they don't want to get involved because they know the price. They know that the public will very likely turn on them if they don't say things to make them happy. One of the interviews that I did, someone had asked me about David Ortiz, you know, saying, this is GBH, so I'm not going to say what Ortiz said, right? Yeah, this is our fucking city, right? That's David Ortiz doing his thing. And someone asked me in an interview, well, wasn't that proof that Boston and that sports fans in general were now going to accept players being involved politically? And I said, absolutely not. It's the exact opposite. He said what they wanted to hear. What if he said, I don't trust cops? Then what? David Ortiz would not be the person in Boston that he is today. He knows it, we know it, everybody knows it. So let's not go too far. Let's not pat ourselves on the back too much. And so this is what players run from, and we criticize them because of that. But at the same time, this responsibility never goes away. And so we had one last go-round with the Reverend, and I just love talking to Al because he's funny. But he's also smart, and he's right on some of these things. And we talked about Michael Jordan as well, and I said that, you know, Michael Jordan was not only not part of the heritage, but had supplanted O.J. Simpson as its greatest threat. Maybe Jordan's exceptional gifts weren't limited to basketball genius. Maybe he understood the American racial power dynamic best, that as romantic as it seemed, black people would never have real power, just as Robeson and King understood that the romance of armed revolution could never be the answer. It didn't come from cowardice, it came from bad math. 12% of the population couldn't overtake any majority by force. Jordan never renounced his racial identity. Jordan steered away from controversies where an affirmation of his blackness was required. By allowing himself to be positioned as elite and wealthy but race neutral, he made greenwashing, which is a term I use in the book for trading your racial identity for money, made greenwashing an essential component of his public persona. Maybe Michael Jordan simply realized that in America, African Americans weren't going to get a majority of the seats at the table, so getting as much money as possible was as good as it's going to get. Maybe, Al Sharpton countered, but that still makes you a coward. So that's where the players are. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why you started to see players back away from this. And then, of course, the combining force was what was taking place in the country. And I'll be very quick, and I'm sure that people have questions, so I won't just blather on here, because I tend to do that. I think one of the hard parts of all this was in the framework of where sports are today. And I think that one of the biggest differences in sports was that sports was supposed to be neutral. Players always had their issues. Players did whatever players wanted to do. But the sport itself made sure that it was neutral on most political issues because they didn't want to upset they didn't want to upset half of the fan base. 9/11 changed that. What 9/11 did was 9/11 made it okay because who's got a problem against fighting terrorism? Who's going to fight that? So post 9/11, and I was covering the Yankees during 9/11, and it was just an unbelievable story in and of itself. The entire selling of the game changed. And one of the very interesting things about that was the singing of God Bless America. It's a very funny story. The reason why God Bless America is sung at ballparks across the country is not because of patriotism. It's because of George Steinbrenner. After, see if I remember this properly, we were home. The Red Sox had played the Yankees. What was really crazy about that was that the Red Sox played the Yankees the weekend before 9/11. They played them weekend series, and then Tuesday was 9/11. I was walking down the street with Jeff Horrigan. He was a baseball writer for the Herald, and we were walking down the street, and we walked past that famous picture where the helicopter crashed into the Chrysler or the Empire State Building or whatever building is. And he said, "Can you imagine that if a plane hit a building?" He actually said that 2 days before it happened. This is a true story. Anyway, I just think that's kind of wild. Anyway, the The Yankees, nobody played for a week. We went to Chicago, and the Mets were at home. And so the Mets were in New York, and the Yankees were in Chicago. And the Yankees were being criticized for not being as patriotic as the Mets. If you remember, the Mets were the team because Bobby Valentine was the manager, and he was a New Yorker. John Franco was a New Yorker, and they set up a staging area at Shea Stadium. Yankee players disappeared. Roger Clemens, Andy Pettitte, Mike Stanton. The minute those towers hit, they rented a car, and they left town. They went to Texas. And so the Yankees were being criticized for not being as involved. The Mets, if you remember, were wearing NYPD hats and FDNY hats and Port Authority hats. And so they were being considered the New York team, that they were the team being associated with fighting terrorism. And George Steinbrenner lost his mind. He's like, there's no way that team is going to get the shine off of this instead of us. So he decided to bring in the great Irish tenor, Ronan Tynan, to sing God Bless America before every game. And within a week, Major League Baseball adopted it as well. And then every team, they made it mandatory, and it's still mandatory to this day. And I went to a Red Sox executive not too long ago, and I asked him, it's been almost 20 years. Why are you still singing God Bless America during the 7th inning? And his response was not, well, we got to support the troops. It's not what he said. What he said was, if we're the first team to stop doing this, we'll get killed publicly. I said, well, that's patriotism right there for you. So, I mean, this is the pressure that is on the public and on these sports teams to continue something that they don't even necessarily believe in. And I think that what's really taking place here in this collision, Ferguson was the big part of the collision, was now you had this selling of patriotism at the ballpark. You had the jingoism, you had sports for sale, and a lot of people were telling me, a lot of veterans were like, well, we don't want to be treated as props. We don't want to have war sold to us at the ballpark. But at the same time, it's sold big. It's a huge seller. All of these alternate jerseys and the camo hats and all of it, they're all #1 sellers. And so people feel a connection to this, even though at the same time there's an uneasiness about what we're actually celebrating. And one of the points I try to make in the book is what happens to jury pools. If you remember, if you walk around like in New York or even DC, where you see people walking around with NYPD hats as if it's a ball team. These are your peers. How are you supposed to convict a cop when the public is wearing their hats? When you see people walk around with FBI baseball caps on and T-shirts, and they're not being ironic. You see people walking around with the CIA baseball cap, and I'm like, they kill people. I mean, these are clandestine organizations that, and this is all taking place when our freedoms are being taken away in terms of surveillance and everything else. All of these different things are taking place, and suddenly they're taking place at the ballpark where we're supposed to be having fun. And so that collision between this increase at the ballpark of patriotism, nationalism, jingoism, all of these different isms you want, militarism, and the black athlete beginning to assert himself and herself once again is really what's taken place in sports, especially now when you have a president who's decided that they're going to score political points with this too, that now to fire up his base and attack the opposition, you now recognize that one way to do that is through athletes, is through attacking the citizenship of a player. And attacking the citizenship of a player, many of these players who have actually done nothing wrong. And that we're willing to be okay with that. What does that say about them? What does it say about us? So, and I thought that one of the parts, and I will open up to questions in just one second, that I really was proud of was talking to veterans and having them talk to me about how they felt. And Chapter 7 is called Props. It's all about the veterans coming back and saying, well, number one, a lot of them saying, okay, we're offended by what some of these black players are doing, but most of them are not. They're like, no, we fought for your right to kneel if you want to kneel. We may not agree with you kneeling, but this is why we did what we did. And that one of the things that's changing in this country right now is that the American flag is to be obeyed as a symbol of the military, not of freedom. It's now a symbol of authority and not a symbol of ideals. And a lot of that is taking place at Fenway Park, or at Gillette, or at Yankee Stadium. And so the paid patriotism part of this to me was a very big deal. And I wrote, maybe it was all the commercials, well-intentioned and heartbreaking, of wounded soldiers and foundations, or maybe it was the insistence that every turn that the paying customer acknowledged multiple times in multiple ways, the generic umbrella of the troops, without going beyond the photo op. Even little kids at baseball games couldn't run the bases after games without paying homage to some military soldier tie-in. Maybe it was the smothering corporate influence on gestures that felt orchestrated. Maybe it was every jersey for every occasion being sold in a desert camo version, along with camo caps and coffee mugs. Or maybe it was just that good old American, old-fashioned bullshit detector that came out when we were having too much of one thing crammed down our throats, with no counterbalancing criticism that made it all feel just a little bit off. It was all the above, naturally, the overdone deference, the ubiquity of soldiers while erasing the word war, being treated like a traitor just for voicing an opinion, the nonstop commercial milking of 9/11 sentiment nearly 20 years after the Twin Towers fell. And then came the day when all the dissenters, the ones who fought and the ones who didn't, and the ones who were pissed off when after 9/11 the president told America not to sacrifice but to shop, the ones who didn't even want to be called dissenters, but were nevertheless offended that it looked like sports teams were using the military for optics but not jobs, finally saw the numbers on the page. It was a bitter vindication and a swift punch in the gut. You could run or sit and take it, but the truth wasn't going anywhere. So much of the patriotism at the ballpark was a deception, one big hoax. And that is the report by Jeff Flake and John McCain called Tackling Paid Patriotism, where he exposed these teams were taking money, where the Milwaukee Brewers charged the Wisconsin National Guard $49,000 to sing God Bless America. And when the Patriots, the great New England Patriots, were charging the Massachusetts National Guard, your taxpayer dollars, your money, our money, for the surprise homecomings on the field and the swearing-in ceremonies at halftime, $280,000. And selling it to you as organic support of the troops. This wasn't patriotism, this was capitalism. And so this is something that the DOD was doing. The Pentagon was doing this, and they didn't even hide it. That's one of the really interesting things about this story. And people have said to me, oh my God, you're so courageous for doing this. I mean, my goodness. And I said, there's no courage in writing this book. They're not hiding it. They're telling you exactly what they're doing. This isn't Woodward and Bernstein here. They're telling you right now what's going on. The military had made a deliberate strategy to target kids watching their favorite team as potential soldiers. The leagues should have been transparent about this. And I talked to General Honoré, Russell Honoré, who's a tremendous person, who was great on the Katrina cleanup, and he's a great person, and I was very happy that he gave me his time. And he is a general. He does have a lot of 3-star in him. It was great talking to him. And he said the kids that go to sporting events have a pretty good tendency to play sports. And to be a warrior, you need to be what we call the warrior athlete. You got to be able to run. You got to be able to jump. You can't be no fat ass. We need the warrior athlete. And people who say they want to go to a game and don't want to see the color guard on the field, I feel sorry for them, but we've got to recruit every opportunity we can to get the right people who want to serve and participate. So once again, this is part of the strategy. And so, last but not least, I say the paid patriotism report was damning, insulting, indicting. It was about phony patriotism, phony concern for veterans, a con. So naturally, having been taken for a ride by the military-industrial complex and by sports owners who couldn't keep their watery beer under $10, but were willing to sell you a special Memorial Day alternate jersey to keep the war machine going, the angry American public revolted, hoisted Jeff Flake and John McCain up by its collective shoulders, and thanked them for being the public watchdogs, keeping the power in check, right? Wrong. Nobody cared. America was so immersed in the reality show that it didn't mind that the reality wasn't real. Nor did McCain and Flake's revelations force the public to even rethink its part in the whole hero business. That was the power of 9/11. It still lingered, and the promotions continued. And I asked Bill Astoria, who's one of the Air Force veterans I spoke with, and I asked him how he felt because he was one of the people on the website Tom Dispatch who's been really, really strong on this issue. And I said to him, "Are you a dissenter?" And he said, "Am I a dissenter? It's a weird label to wear. I like to think I'm being patriotic when I call attention to the corporate military's blatant propaganda and manipulation of the masses. I see them, with all their warrior and warfighter talk, as dissenters from the proud tradition of a citizen soldier military. What I mean is this: if we label ourselves as dissenters, we are automatically dismissed by many as un-American. Terminology is critical, and I don't have an easy answer. Again, who is the patriot? Isn't dissent patriotic?" So that's the story. And I think that's sort of where we are right now, and that's one of the reasons why I thought this was a really important story to get involved in and to tackle and to see what I could do with it. And I felt as well that one of the important things was seeing the athlete use his and her voice. I thought that was really important as well, because we criticize these players as what I refer to as staying behind the tinted glass of their Escalades. Now they're not. And I like that they're back. And I like that we hear from them. And I also feel that as long as we value in this country, as we value the black body over the black brain, we do need to hear from them, because they're the ones we listen to. They're the ones we pay attention to. So you can't have it both ways. You can't not have black owners and black leaders in the country, or undo everything they did just because you had one, and then tell the ball player to be quiet. It doesn't work that way. Or at least it shouldn't work that way. So we'll see what these players do, and we'll see what we do as citizens. But that's the story. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes, sir.
Two things: being a veteran and going to the Houston Texans game. I looked on the Patriots sideline, and there's about a dozen guys taking a knee. And the first thing that came to my thought was, what are they doing? And then when the issue came up of the pay for play that the military was paying the owners, it came to a conclusion really quick that pay for play. And I also thought that the players' rights for self-expression by the First Amendment, why are they being told to go to the side? I mean, we're supposed to be able to dissent, and management and the president wants to take away that dissent.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and you actually bring up two separate issues. Issue one is the question of dissent. Issue two is, why are the players on their knees? Why are the players taking it? They're not the same thing. But you are right that in this arena, this is the visibility. This is the area where people will pay attention. And I talked to Colin Kaepernick about this last year. And I said, well, you got their attention. And that is part of it. And I think that's one of the issues that I have with the players, is that so many players make it seem like getting the public's attention doesn't mean anything. It means a lot. I mean, that's the reason why we're talking about this, is because people are paying attention because of what the players did. But I do think that we are at a very critical point where we are giving away a lot that belongs to us. And I'm fascinated by the number of employees who say, well, if it was at my job, I'd be fired. Well, you're not them. And maybe instead of saying they shouldn't be able to do it, maybe you should wonder who you work for if you can't be a citizen. Maybe think about it that way. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little, you said something about protests can be profitable. Can you elaborate on that and then talk about the different dynamics between the NBA and the players and owners and coaches and that dynamic, and the NFL and baseball?
Huge difference. Yeah. Well, I think first, and it's a great question, I think first, We know that corporations in general are looking to be hip. They want to be cool. They're trying to find that 18 to 24 demographic. You know, every time I look in the mirror and I haven't shaved, I'm like, oh no, there's gray in there. I'm not in part of the demographic anymore. Soon to be invisible. And so we know that this is what they're trying to do. And we've seen this with the Kylie Jenner Pepsi commercial when they should co-opt, Kendall Jenner, yeah, thank you, when she, like I said, I am old, right? I don't know my Jenners from my Kardashians. And so there's money to be made on that side. There's money to be made looking cool. Look at Nike, for example. Nike did the whole equality thing when North Carolina had the HB1 bill and they pulled the All-Star game out of New Orleans and all of that. And they made this big commercial and they profited from this because Nike's the good company now. After Tamir Rice was killed, Nike was offering, and they still do, they offer a 20% discount to all law enforcement. They don't advertise that. But if you hop on Nike's website and you go up to discounts, if you're part of the police, you can buy their sneakers at a 20% discount or 10% or whatever the discount is. So there's profit in all of this. There's profit in the flag on this side. There's profit in LeBron James out there wearing your clothes because he's on the right side of issues. And that goes back to this question of the heritage that I was talking about earlier, which is, do you get to join Jackie Robinson by wearing a pair of sneakers? And that's the one thing about Colin Kaepernick that I appreciate about him, is that he actually put some skin in the game. He actually risked his career. Does he still have a bunch of money? Yeah, he's got a bunch of money. But he didn't have to do this. He actually risked something. And that was, it's funny when you talk about doing books, this book is nothing like what the proposal was and what the original outline was. They had a big chapter of all these different players, and I took all that out. And the reason why I took it out was because I wasn't sure I believed it. I was like, I don't know if I want to put this in this book, because I think I was talking about Serena and Venus, and one point I'm like, okay, well, a lot of these players are doing what they're doing backed by their corporations. How courageous is that? Seriously, I mean, I didn't know the answer, so I didn't want to criticize it, but I also didn't want to glorify it, so I said, let's just take it out. You're not going to be there until I have an idea. As for the other sports, the National Basketball Association understands, it's got an 80% black workforce. It understands also that there was a time when I was a little kid, when I was 12, 1980, yeah. Goodness. I didn't say that, GBH, did I? I did. You know, when the NBA Finals were on tape delay, but nobody was watching. And before Bird and Magic came along, nobody was watching that league. They remember what that was like. They know that they have to get along with their players. If they don't get along with their players, they may go back to the Stone Age. They've got something going that's great right now. If you go back to Donald Sterling, when he talked about, you know, whatever was on that tape with him and his girlfriend about, you know, not wanting black people coming to his games even though his whole team was black. The players, LeBron, especially Carmelo Anthony's real radical guy on these issues. He still believes to this day that the players should not have trusted Adam Silver. They trusted Adam Silver to get Donald Sterling out of there, and they got rid of him. But he's like, no, we should have boycotted the entire playoffs. Then they would have listened to us. The NFL, on the other hand, does not do that. The NFL looks at its players as chattel. It looks at them as cattle, not just chattel. I mean, it looks at them as they wear helmets so you don't see their faces. You control their money. Everyone talks about what a great coach Bill Belichick is, and he is a great coach. However, he controls your money. Basketball players' money is 100% guaranteed. LeBron James does not have to listen to you, Bill Belichick. But Tom Brady's and the rest of the players do, because they don't control, the NFL contracts are not guaranteed. So the management side of the labor battle in football is so overwhelmingly in favor of ownership that the players don't feel like they've got that kind of power. Whereas baseball and basketball, those contracts are completely guaranteed. So leverage. And once again, as Don Fear, the great labor leader, used to tell me, everyone thinks the game is Red Sox-Yankees. The game is owners versus players. Yes.
Two more.
Two more, that's it? God, I was looking for you. Why didn't you give me the sign? I talked too long. Okay, really? Upton, yes.
As somebody who was alive in 1946 to see the great Kenny Washington play the same backfield with Jackie Robinson at UCLA.
Sure did.
Woody Strode, who was the great actor in Spartacus, I saw them break the color line. I saw the NFL go all the way through to today. I also saw the South in the 60s, and my great worry is the things I saw as a scout with the Colts are coming back today. So my question to you, and this is, by the way, a great book, and I read a lot of books. This is absolutely tells the truth. My question is, who's going to be the person, in spite of what you say about the NFL, which is true, who's going to be the Curt Flood that steps up with the NFL and says, you know what, let's end this. Let's put a stop to saying, and this will divide the players, I guarantee you, stay in the locker room or come out and kneel and be fine. That is one of the most negative things I've ever seen. And you have observed this for all these years. And if you were to pick somebody, the NFL is 70% African American. And yet, as you said, it has the least amount of power of any sport. Where is that? Who is that going to be? Or will it ever be?
Upton, I don't think it's going to be anybody. I think it's the public. I think when the public decides that this isn't worth it, and when they see the numbers dropping, then they'll respond. But until the public decides that, you know what, we're not really that into you, I don't think anything's going to change. I'm going to talk real fast. Who's next?
So Colin Kaepernick obviously is well-read and well-studied and is able to articulate and express the injustices that he's supporting. At one point during Cam Newton's MVP season, he actually tried to do some talking on some of this stuff.
Up Cam.
No, well, I just wonder if a lot of this has to do with some of the players lacking the proper information and the ability to articulate and express what it is that they're actually opposing, as opposed to just commenting on their feelings or trying to jump onto something else. Does that make sense?
It does. If you're not smart, you shouldn't talk about this. That's all. The minute I see Cam at a mic, I'm like, Cam shouldn't be talking about this. Yes, sir.
I was going off the previous question, talking about the commodification of protest, or the potential for commodification of protest. What do you think, I guess it's a hard question to answer, but what is going to be the legacy of this current moment? Because I think of, for example, the Patriots. Like, you could look at Bob Kraft and say, okay, Trump supported, but also then there's the pictures of Bob Kraft with Meek Mill, and right, because, but you know, like, how the hell Bob Kraft met Meek Mill, or even heard of Meek Mill, I don't know. But you know, how do we balance out sort of these publicity efforts and sort of the actual substance that's occurring?
Yeah, I think you have to give time. I think over time we'll sit back and we'll see what it looks like. We'll see how it plays out. Right now, I think that the players are spending a lot of time trying to make it look good, and I think that they're spending a lot of time trying to think that they can work inside of systems. And I think they're doing a lot of optic stuff. But at the end of the day, they still don't have any power. They still don't control who the commissioner is. They're still, if they had power, if this was a relationship that you would view with as an equitable one, then the owners wouldn't have stabbed him in the back and put an anthem policy after they had a deal. So once again, this is what's for show and what's real. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your book in chapter 7 the idea about props. And I'm wondering, like, for an athlete, it is difficult and risky to protest in some ways because you're afraid you might lose money, but isn't just having like those big zeros in your paycheck and the corporate endorsement deals another way of saying, look at the diamond, don't look here, like distraction, as opposed to, it feels kind of like modern day, I don't want to say slavery, but just kind of like, just do what I say and shut up or you won't get paid.
Yeah, well, that's where we are right now as well. When you look at when you look at the power of the corporation is essentially telling you that we're not going to argue with you anymore. We're going to deny your employment. We're going to take your money. And somebody asked me, I'll be very quick on this, somebody said to me, because I hate making mistakes, I hate having holes in my game, but we all do, right? A friend of mine said, where are the women in your book? And I'm like, I was like, there are women. I cut them out, right? Well, I mean, they're in there. They're just not in there. They didn't get their own chapter anymore. Rachel's in there. There's a lot of people in there. Martina's in there. But I bring up the women because, to your point, WNBA players were fantastic on these issues, and they stuck together, and they looked better than the men because there are no white male players outside of Chris Long who are really siding with their players. They talk, you know, the guys are always talking about, yeah, we're in this together, and this is a brotherhood, and it's us against the world, and they leave the black players to do it all by themselves. The women didn't do that. However, WNBA players make $60,000 a year on average. NBA players make $6 million. But the individual sports, Serena's got $85 million in earnings, and the female individual athletes, they're the ones who make the money. The problem is, if you're Gabby Douglas or Simone Biles or Serena, if you start causing trouble, your sponsors are going directly after your income. They don't have the protection that LeBron has. They don't have the protection that the athletes, that the team sport players have because they've got a salary coming in. So to answer your question, it's been a really difficult thing because the corporations are making it very clear that their strategy is to shut you out completely. It's to go after your money.
Well, what about boycotting, like the public say, I'm not going to buy like more Nike stuff, I'm not going to buy any more jerseys?
It's up to the public. Well, I mean, Upton's question was, who's going to be the one? You're going to be the one. Yeah. Well, and on that note, thank you all so much for coming.